Two searchers were walking a dry wash in Death Valley when they found a German identification card lying near human remains. It was 2009. 13 years earlier, a family of 4 had vanished from that same desert. Almost everything they owned was left behind. A rented minivan, 3 tires torn apart, every belonging still inside. For 13 years, nobody could say where they'd gone after they walked away from that van. We'll come back to that. First, a boat that kept moving long after its passengers were gone. The boat was still stocked when they found it. Food for the rest of the trip. Camping gear, a diary, money, a rifle, untouched, resting where it had been packed. Everything a person would need to keep going down the river. The only thing missing was the 2 people who were supposed to be using it. It was 1928, and Glenn and Bessie Hyde were newlyweds. They'd been married only a few months when Glenn proposed the kind of honeymoon most people would never consider. A trip down the Colorado River, through the Grand Canyon, on a wooden boat he'd built himself. Glenn wasn't a professional boatman. He was ambitious and in a hurry. He wanted to set a speed record for the run. Bessie, for her part, wasn't along for the ride out of obligation. If she completed the trip, she'd become the first woman on record to make it through the canyon by river. She was in this as much as he was. They'd been seen along the way, stopping for supplies, writing letters, looking, by all accounts, like 2 people in good spirits on a hard trip. Then they continued downriver toward the next stretch of rapids, and nobody saw them again. At first, nobody panicked. This was the Grand Canyon in 1928. There was no way to call ahead, no way to check in, and river travel didn't run on a schedule. A late arrival wasn't unusual. Weather could hold a boat up, so could a damaged sweep, a slow current, or a couple deciding to camp an extra night somewhere scenic. But the days kept passing, and eventually the delay stopped looking ordinary. Glenn's father made the trip out west himself once it became clear something was wrong. Search efforts began along a route that was almost impossible to reach by land. The river had a head start on any evidence, carrying it downstream before anyone even knew where to look. There was no emergency signal, no witnesses to whatever had happened, no campsite left in disarray. Nothing to go on except the fact that 2 people who should have arrived hadn't. Then a search plane spotted the boat. It was upright, not smashed against rocks, not torn apart the way you'd expect if it had capsized violently in a rapid. It looked, more than anything, like it had simply been left. The supplies were still aboard. Investigators know only this much for certain. The boat and the couple's most important belongings were recovered without them. The most reasonable explanation is that one or both of them went overboard in a difficult stretch of river, something that happened to other boatmen on the Colorado, even with far more experience than Glenn had. Whether there was ever an argument, a struggle, or anything beyond a simple accident is something nobody has ever been able to say. Searchers combed the surrounding banks and the length of river they could access. No bodies were ever recovered. That's unsettling to hear, but it isn't as impossible as it sounds. The Colorado River in a canyon that deep can carry a person a long way, or conceal them somewhere no search team will ever reach. Picture it now, the boat drifting, or sitting still against the bank, in a canyon a mile deep in places. Cold water moving fast beneath high stone walls. The rapids never stop making noise, and inside the boat, gears shifting slightly with the current, waiting for 2 people who are never coming back to claim it. The official search wound down without answers. Glenn and Bessie's families were left to carry on without anything close to certainty. Their trip became a small, strange footnote in Grand Canyon history, a boat with a full inventory and no passengers. For decades, that might have been the end of it, a mystery with nothing left to add. Then, years later, an elderly woman came forward and claimed she was Bessie Hyde. She said she'd survived the trip, and that she had killed Glenn before walking away from the canyon and starting a new life under a different name. For a moment, that claim changed everything. It offered a motive, it offered an ending. Then it fell apart. The woman later withdrew or contradicted parts of her story. It was never substantiated. Other supposed leads and possible remains were examined over the years, and none of them resolved the case either. So the questions remain open. Did Glenn and Bessie go into the water together, in the same moment? Did one try to save the other, and lose that fight too? Why was the boat never damaged the way you'd expect from whatever ended their trip? And did it happen right where the boat was found, or somewhere far upstream, with the current carrying the evidence down to meet the searchers? Glenn wanted to move fast through water that punished impatience. That may well have been part of what went wrong. But wanting something isn't proof of what happened, and there's no way to prove intent from an empty boat. The most likely explanation is still the simplest one: a river accident, in dangerous water, on a trip built for speed rather than caution. But without a body, without a witness, and without a damaged hull to read like a record, nobody has ever been able to say for certain where the honeymoon ended and the empty boat began its journey alone. The Grand Canyon case may have started with the river itself, water, distance, and an accident nobody witnessed. The next story is different. In Shenandoah, the danger wasn't the landscape, it was another person who found a campsite that was meant to be private. The dog came back alone. His name was Taj, and he belonged to Julianne Williams and Laura Lolly Winans, two experienced outdoors women who'd set out for a backcountry hiking and camping trip in Shenandoah National Park in the spring of 1996. A dog returning without its owners is one of those small, believable details that doesn't need embellishment to be alarming. It's not proof of anything terrible, but it's the kind of thing that makes people start asking questions faster than they otherwise would. Julie and Lolly weren't inexperienced. This wasn't a first camping trip or an impulsive weekend decision. They knew what they were doing outdoors, and they'd chosen a secluded site, away from the busier, more visible parts of the park, the kind of spot people pick specifically because it feels private and safe. When they didn't return as planned, and Taj turned up wandering without them, rangers and family members had to start with the ordinary possibilities. Backcountry trips don't always run on schedule. The two of them might have gotten separated. One might have been injured and the other staying with her. The dog might have slipped his lead and wandered off on his own, unrelated to whatever else was happening. But the search that followed didn't turn up an injury, or a delay, or a simple explanation. Rangers traced the route the two women had planned to take. Searchers worked through the trails and the kinds of spots experienced hikers tend to choose for camping. The seclusion that had made the site appealing made it harder to find quickly, and Taj's presence, alone, kept pointing towards something worse than a scheduling mix-up. Eventually, searchers located the campsite near the Skyland area of the park. The site hadn't been abandoned because the two of them had changed their plans. Julie and Lolly were found there, and the scene made clear that this wasn't an accident or a medical emergency. Investigators believed someone else had entered or approached that secluded site. What matters here isn't the specifics of the crime scene, it's the fact that a place chosen for its privacy had, at some point, stopped being private at all. The investigation that followed stretched on for years. Witnesses were interviewed. People who had been in or near the park around that time were looked at. Physical evidence was collected and preserved, even when there wasn't enough, yet, to build a case against anyone. More than once, investigators believed they were close. A person of interest would emerge, get looked at hard, and then the case against him would quietly fall apart before it ever reached a courtroom. Suspects came up. Theories circulated. None of it was enough to bring a charge. It's worth being clear here. Early theories and early suspects were never proof of anything. And this isn't a story about accusing someone who was never conclusively tied to what happened. Picture the campsite itself, not the worst of it, just the setting. Trees close enough to limit visibility in every direction. Camping gear left exactly where it had been set down. Taj, somewhere out there, having survived whatever the two women hadn't. And underneath all of it, a realization that would settle over the case for years afterward. Whoever did this had known exactly where to find them, in a place that was supposed to be nearly impossible to find. For a long time, that was where the case stayed. Evidence sat in storage. Investigators moved on to other assignments or retired altogether. Families waited through a silence that had no clear endpoint. The park kept receiving visitors, season after season, most of them with no idea that a stretch of that backcountry carried this kind of history. For almost 30 years, that silence held. Then something happened that nobody working the case in 1996 could have counted on. Decades later, modern forensic testing was applied to crime scene evidence that had been preserved all that time. DNA recovered from the scene was matched to Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a man with a documented history of violent sexual offenses. Investigators had enough to link him to the site strongly enough that the FBI publicly identified him as the person responsible. Jackson had already died in prison, serving time for other crimes by the time that identification was made. Exactly how he came across Julie and Lolly in the first place is a different matter entirely. Nobody has established whether he encountered them by chance, whether he'd seen them somewhere more public earlier that day, or whether he had followed them out to that secluded site with intent from the start. The reveal changes how the whole case reads. What looked for years like an almost untraceable crime in an unreachable stretch of wilderness now has a name attached to it. But a name isn't the same as a full account of what happened, or why, or how long he'd known exactly where they were. The weakness in this story was never that Julie and Lolly chose to camp somewhere secluded. It was the broader assumption, one that held for a long time, that isolation on its own meant safety. In 1996, there was no easy way to track who else had been moving through that part of the park. There was no modern forensic database standing by to catch a match right away. The systems that eventually solved this case simply didn't exist yet. Investigators can now say, with confidence, whose DNA was at that campsite. What they still can't do is walk back through the exact sequence of that day, the moment an ordinary backcountry trip stopped being ordinary and became something no amount of seclusion could have protected against. Cases like these stay with people because the details are real and because so much can remain unknown even after an investigation technically ends. If stories told carefully, without exaggeration, are worth something to you, consider subscribing to support more of them. The next case begins with a child disappearing less than 5 minutes from his family. It started as a game. In June of 1969, a group of children on a family trip through the Great Smoky Mountains decided to hide in the brush near Spence Field and jump out to surprise the adults waiting for them. It's the kind of moment that happens on countless family hikes without anyone thinking twice about it. Dennis Martin was 6 years old. He was there with his father, his grandfather, and his older brother, continuing a family tradition of hiking trips through that part of the park. He was wearing a bright red shirt that day, along with green trousers and ordinary shoes, the kind of outfit that should have made him easy to spot against the green of the mountainside. The other children came back out from their hiding spots to surprise the adults, laughing. The game finished. Dennis didn't come back with them. At first, that wasn't alarming on its own. Kids get the order of a game wrong sometimes. He might have misunderstood where to meet everyone. He might still have been hiding, waiting for a reaction that wasn't coming. He might have followed one of the other children in the wrong direction, or simply be walking back from a slightly different angle than expected, hidden for another minute by the trees and undergrowth. His father didn't wait long to check. Within what accounts describe as 3 to 5 minutes, ordinary concern had already turned into active searching. That speed matters. This wasn't a case where hours passed before anyone noticed something was wrong. Dennis's father and other relatives began calling for him and searching the immediate area almost as soon as the game ended. Other visitors nearby quickly became aware that a child was missing, and the woods gave nothing back. No answering call, no sign of a small boy in a shirt that should have stood out clearly against the trees. For a search that started this fast, that should have been enough. It wasn't, because within hours, the one thing working in Dennis's favor, how quickly his father reacted, was about to be canceled out by something nobody could control. Then the weather turned. Severe thunderstorms rolled into the mountains, and they changed the entire situation. Visibility dropped, trails turned slick and dangerous. Streams that had been manageable began to rise. Any tracks that might have shown which direction Dennis had gone were at serious risk of being washed out or damaged. Sound became harder to track through the rain and wind. And somewhere out there, if he was still moving at all, Dennis was facing falling temperatures with nothing but the clothes he'd worn for an afternoon hike. The storm was real, and it was a serious complicating factor. It wasn't anything more mysterious than bad timing. What followed became one of the largest search operations in the history of the National Park Service. Park rangers, local rescue teams, volunteers, National Guard units, military personnel, aircraft, and tracking dogs all took part at different points. At the search's peak, the number of people involved reached roughly 1,400. That scale creates its own strange tension. The more people looking, the stranger it feels that nothing was found. But there's a practical side to that too. A search that large, moving through the same terrain repeatedly, can end up damaging the very tracks and signs it's trying to follow, especially after a storm has already disturbed the ground. At one point, tracking dogs picked up a scent strong enough that searchers believed, for a few hours, they'd finally caught the break they needed. Teams moved in fast. Then the trail went cold, the same way every other lead in this case had gone cold before it. Picture that first night, heavy rain hitting the leaves, flashlights sweeping through fog and thick vegetation, people calling his name into the dark, thunder swallowing sounds that might otherwise have carried, searchers moving over the same slopes and paths again and again. And through all of it, no red shirt catching in a flashlight beam. No answer. The search didn't end after that first terrible night. It continued for days, then weeks, then months, gradually scaling back as leads were exhausted. Search sectors were repeated. Dogs were brought in and moved to new areas. Aircraft widened their coverage. Dennis's family stayed close by as long as they could. And through all of it, no confirmed clothing, no personal item, and no remains belonging to Dennis were ever recovered. Years afterward, one report kept resurfacing in accounts of the case. A tourist family in the area at the time said they'd heard a scream, and separately reported seeing a disheveled man moving through the vegetation with something slung over his shoulder. This detail needs to be handled with real care. A report like this was, without question, associated with the search, and it later became central to abduction theories surrounding the case. That much isn't in dispute. Everything past that point is murkier. The exact timing of the report, the precise details of what was seen or heard, whether it had any real connection to Dennis at all, and whether the information even reached searchers quickly enough to have mattered, none of that has ever been pinned down. It is not proof of a kidnapping. It's an unresolved thread that has never been confirmed or ruled out. So the theories remain open, without a clear answer among them. He may have moved downhill along terrain that carried him quickly out of the search area before anyone realized how far he'd gone. He may have been injured or overcome by exposure in terrain difficult enough that remains could go undiscovered for decades or forever. Wildlife involvement is possible in a setting like that, though there's no confirmed evidence pointing specifically to it. And the disputed sighting has kept the abduction theory alive for over 50 years without ever being backed by a confirmed suspect or direct evidence. There were real, systemic reasons the search struggled the way it did. The storm arrived fast and without much warning. Heavy foot traffic from the search itself may have damaged tracks that could have told a clearer story. Different agencies involved used different search methods, which didn't always align well with each other. Early information may not have moved efficiently between witnesses on the ground and the people coordinating the search, and the search itself initially focused on the likely behavior of a lost child moving in a predictable pattern, when Dennis may have gone somewhere far less expected. None of that is a failure on his father's part. He responded within minutes. The gap wasn't in the family's reaction. It was somewhere in the terrain, the timing, and the storm that arrived exactly when it could do the most damage. Dennis disappeared during a game meant to last only a few moments. The other children stepped back out of the trees laughing. His father walked toward the spot where he'd last seen his son. And somewhere inside that short window, 3 minutes, maybe 5, the trail ended before anyone even understood there was a trail worth trying to preserve. Dennis vanished close to his family and left almost nothing behind for searchers to work with. The final story is the opposite. Investigators found a vehicle. They found belongings, tracks, evidence of movement, but every one of those clues pointed into one of the emptiest landscapes in North America. Inside the abandoned minivan were the kinds of things you'd expect from any family on holiday. Camping gear, children's belongings, rolls of camera film, travel maps, a compact spare tire, a jack, still on its hook, never used. Outside, 3 of the van's tires were destroyed, and the vehicle was buried in loose desert sand, going nowhere. The real question this story raises isn't only where the family went after they left the van, it's why walking away from it, out into open desert, must have felt like the safer choice at the time. It was 1996, and 4 German tourists were making their way through the American Southwest in a rented Plymouth Voyager. Egbert Rimkus was traveling with his son, Georg Weber, along with Cornelia Meyer and her son, Max. They'd already covered a number of major destinations on their trip. They had a rental return date coming up, and flights home to Germany already booked. That itinerary put real pressure on them to keep moving, even as the roads they were driving got rougher. At a stop near Warm Spring, they left an entry in a visitor log. "We are going over the pass." The most likely reference is Mengel Pass, a route that turns rough fast and isn't suited to an ordinary rented minivan built for pavement, not backcountry desert roads. On its own, that note wouldn't mean much. It only becomes unsettling in hindsight, once you already know this family never made it back. At the time, though, the decision may not have felt reckless at all. They'd already made it across dirt roads successfully earlier in the trip. Certain sections of the route toward the pass may have looked manageable at first glance. Maps have a way of flattening genuinely difficult terrain down into a single confident line, especially for travelers unfamiliar with how deceptive that terrain can be. They may have believed the route connected back to a more populated area on the other side, and their return deadline made a long retreat back the way they came feel like a worse option than continuing forward. The road likely didn't announce its danger all at once. Each mile that turned out to be passable would have reinforced the idea that the next one probably would be too. Evidence later suggested the family reached, or at least stopped at, the stone cabin in Butte Valley. It offered shelter, some shade, a nearby water source, and a clear point of reference along their route. An American flag connected to the cabin was later recovered from the van, supporting the idea that they had in fact been there. This is the turning point that matters most in the whole case. The cabin may have represented their best, most reliable chance at shelter and eventual rescue. There's no evidence they understood that at the time. They may simply have believed nobody would think to look for them at an isolated stone structure in the middle of nowhere, and their tight schedule likely made the idea of waiting there feel impossible regardless. From what's been reconstructed, the family discovered that the route over Mengle Pass wasn't going to work for their vehicle. That left them with a narrowing set of options. Attempt the pass anyway, reverse a long distance back over rough terrain they'd already struggled with, wait at the cabin, or search for an alternate route. They appear to have chosen an alternate path, through Anvil Canyon. It's possible a simplified or outdated map made that route look like it connected to safer roads beyond. This part of the story comes from later reconstruction, not from anything the family documented themselves, and it should be understood that way. Whatever they were thinking as they turned into that canyon, there's one thing the evidence makes brutally clear. The vehicle that got them this far wasn't going to get them much further. The van didn't survive the attempt. Evidence from the vehicle and the tracks around it shows that tires were damaged along the way, and that the van kept moving after that damage began. Eventually, it became stuck for good, in deep sand and rocky wash terrain. One compact spare tire was never going to be enough to fix 3 failures. And a jack, however well packed, can't lift a vehicle that's already sunk into terrain like that. That unused jack, sitting on its hook inside the van, isn't a sign that the family didn't understand how to use it. It's a sign that, by the point they needed it, it simply couldn't have helped. At some stage, all 4 of them left the vehicle on foot, roughly 1.7 miles away. Searchers later found a beer bottle near a small area of disturbed ground, in what little shade the terrain offered. It suggests at least one person moved down the canyon that far, and stopped there for a while. Who was carrying it? Whether all 4 of them were still together at that point, what condition they were in, or which direction they intended to go from there. None of that survives in the evidence. It's proof of movement. It isn't a map of their final route. 13 years passed with the case largely unresolved. And then 2 men, searching an area nobody had seriously considered before, found the one thing 13 years of silence hadn't been able to erase. In 2009, search and rescue volunteers Tom Mahood and Les Walker went looking in a southern stretch of desert, based on a new theory about where the family might have gone. What they found, piece by piece, reframed the entire case. A discarded wine bottle, fabric caught in desert vegetation, a water-damaged daily planner with German handwriting still legible inside it. Eventually, a radio call reporting the discovery of what appeared to be human remains. Among the recovered items was identification belonging to Cornelia Meyer. The physical details of what was found don't matter as much as the moment itself. 2 searchers realizing that this family had, in fact, traveled in a direction the original search had never fully resolved or ruled out. What followed was procedural, not dramatic. Coordinates were logged, authorities were notified, search teams returned to establish a proper evidence grid. Personal effects and remains were examined by investigators. Family members back in Germany were informed. There was no confession to close the case, no full reconstruction of exactly what happened in the family's final hours. Just careful, ongoing work spread out across a very large desert. One theory, put forward by Mahood, has become the leading explanation for why the family may have gone the way they did. He suggested they may have been walking toward the boundary of the China Lake military installation, reasoning that a facility like that should have a fence. A fence could be followed, a boundary might mean patrols, a guarded entrance might mean water and help. and a way back to civilization. In that moment, it may have looked closer and more promising than turning back through the canyon they'd already struggled through. The tragedy in that logic is how reasonable it sounds, and how badly it likely failed them. A massive American desert military boundary doesn't necessarily resemble the compact, clearly marked bases many European travelers might expect. There may have been no visible fence nearby, no building in sight, no regular patrol passing anywhere close, no one waiting at any boundary they eventually reached, if they reached one at all. Seen that way, their apparent path south wasn't aimless wandering. It may have been a rational plan, built carefully on an assumption about the landscape that simply wasn't true. A number of questions remain, and likely always will. Why did they leave the shelter and water of the stone cabin behind? It offered real safety, but they may not have believed anyone would think to search there, and their flight schedule likely made waiting feel like the riskier choice. Why not stay with the van, the way most survival guidance recommends? The van was remote enough that they may have doubted anyone would spot it in time. Why go south specifically? The military boundary theory fits the evidence well, but their actual intended destination was never documented anywhere. Did all four of them stay together the whole way? The evidence doesn't fully confirm that. And why weren't the children's remains conclusively identified, the way the adults eventually were? Scattering across such a vast area, combined with time and exposure, may explain it, but there's no way to say for certain. None of this points to a failure by the original search teams. They were thorough, and they worked from the most probable routes available to them at the time, based on the van's location and the beer bottle found nearby. The family may have gone somewhere that looked illogical to experienced searchers, but entirely reasonable to tourists, who expected a staffed, visible military boundary somewhere in that direction. What really happened here wasn't a single bad decision. It was a slow accumulation of understandable ones. The van had handled earlier dirt roads without trouble. The map showed the route continuing. They'd already reached remote, difficult places without serious incident. They passed the stone cabin before they had any real reason to believe they were in danger. Turning back got harder with every additional mile they covered. The tire damage didn't stop the van immediately, so they kept going, and by the time it finally failed for good, every option left in front of them was already dangerous. There's a broader lesson buried in this too, about how information can quietly fail people even when nobody's being careless. A line on a map doesn't communicate what kind of vehicle a road actually requires. Remote routes often don't carry the warnings that visitors, especially visitors from somewhere else entirely, might reasonably expect. And a military boundary, on a map, can look like a destination, when in practice it's hundreds of square miles of nothing at all. Inside that van, still, are the objects that tell half the story. The unused jack, the spare tire that was never going to be enough, children's belongings, packed for a family holiday that was supposed to end with a flight home, and the empty canyon stretching out beyond the windshield, in every direction, offering no clue about what was actually out there. The adults were eventually connected to that southern search area, 13 years after they vanished. The children were not conclusively found, and no piece of evidence recovered since has ever revealed the exact moment this family realized that the direction they believed led towards safety contained no safety at all. Closing, 4 different parks, 4 different kinds of danger, and underneath all of them, the same quiet thread, an empty boat that kept moving after its passengers didn't. A campsite chosen for privacy that ended up costing 2 people everything. A few minutes of hide and seek that swallowed a 6-year-old whole. A family who read the landscape the only way they knew how, and paid for a small human misunderstanding about how far help actually was. None of these are stories about people being careless. They're stories about ordinary decisions, made in ordinary moments, that turned out to be impossible to take back. A boat moving a little too fast, a campsite a little too far from anyone else, a game that lasted a few minutes too long, a road that looked passable right up until it wasn't. That's what makes places like these carry weight long after the search teams go home. Not monsters, not anything waiting in the dark, just distance, timing, and the space between a reasonable choice and an irreversible one. If any of these stories stayed with you, let us know which one in the comments. If you've had your own experience in the backcountry, something that still doesn't sit right with you, we'd genuinely like to hear it. And if you want more stories like these, told carefully and without exaggeration, consider subscribing and sharing this one with someone else who'd appreciate it too.